Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second week of our class. Hopefully, you have all noticed that this week and last, all of the readings are available on Venkel Hall. So you've got a little bit of breathing room. It's going to be that way for the first 5 weeks of the course, first 4 weeks. So if you don't have access to the two assigned textbooks yet, you know, you've got some breathing room. Don't worry about it. Um, as always, please reach out to me if you'd like to go over any of the focus or discussion board questions, or if you have any other random course or even non-course related questions. So this week I want to deal with the Crusades, not so much to focus on the battles and strategies, but to look at why on earth they happened to begin with. Then I want to think about their long-term consequences, and that's something that we'll be coming back to quite a bit in this class. So the Crusades are the first of the big disasters that we're going to be dealing with. Next week and the following week, we'll consider the Mongol invasions and the Black Plague, respectively, all as the kinds of disasters that changed the world as they knew it, and sort of left open a blank slate where anything could have happened. Since this isn't a choose your own adventure class, but a history class, we'll also talk about what actually happened. Let me move my face out of the way for a second. But I do want to leave open contingencies as well. So when I talked about, let's move to the next slide. Yep, there we are. Where can I put my face? And I might not need my face. I'll have my face be very small up in the corner here. Okay, so when I talked about world systems last week, I mentioned that for a very long time, Western Europe was on the periphery of the more moving and shaking parts of the world. That might seem ironic given that for much of the last 200 years, it's been the most powerful region in the world. And if you count the United States as part of this Atlantic world, it's arguably still the most powerful part of the world, but for much of its history, this region, Western Europe, has been sort of a backwater with varying degrees of contact with the outside powers. So I want to focus specifically on France right now. So the area that is France was incorporated into the Roman Empire about 50 years before the Common Era. It became an incredibly prosperous province known after its Celtic inhabitants as Gaul. Gaul was how Romans said Celt. So, but that stability came crashing apart with Germanic invasions, the same Germanic invasions that would eventually lead to the end of the Western Roman Republic, or at least its radical transformation. So, the people who took over the area of France were the Franks, and the people who took over France were the Franks, and the country today is named after them rather than the previous Celtic inhabitants. Though there are still people in France who speak a Celtic language known as Breton. It's if you can see my cursor, it's in this region, the Normandy region of France. So, and I I it's related to Welsh. It's a Brythonic Celtic language. So these Frankish invaders, though, they were nothing like the Roman rulers that they replaced. Rome was powerful and well organized. It had infrastructure and bureaucracy. The Franks, by contrast, were a military elite with comparably little administrative power. One aspect of this is reflected today in the French language. French today is a Romance language, meaning it is Latin based with significant Celtic influences on its grammar and lexicon. Romance refers to Rome, and Latin was the language of that empire. So other Romance languages are Italian and Spanish, and then way over on the other side of Europe, you have Romanian and well Portuguese as well. So the Franks, however, they spoke a Germanic language that's closely related to modern day Dutch, and that Germanic language has had virtually no influence on modern French, at least far less than the Gallo-Romance language spoken by the majority of the population. So one piece of evidence for, the weak rule of these Frankish rulers is that nobody in France even speaks their language today. So among the loose confederation of early Frankish rulers, one royal dynasty that emerged was the Merovingians, who under Clovis would vie with mayors and nobility to claim to be kings of as much of the Frankish realms as possible. One of their later descendants would form the Carolingian dynasty, named, of course, after himself. His name was Charles Martel. Karl being a Germanic way to say Charles. One of his descendants his grandson would outdo him by naming himself Charles the Great, or Charlemagne, and he would unite much of Western Europe into his empire. And if we were in a physical classroom right now, I'd ask you what you know about him, and chances are you probably would have a decent amount that you could say, and you'd certainly probably heard of him. So the goal of the question and a little conversation um, would the reason I would ask that in the classroom is just to point out that Charlemagne is a big deal. He's a big deal in European memories. So let's jump to more on the Franks. So one of the problems with the Frankish rulers was that um, no one ever clearly knew who was in charge, or maybe it's better to say too many people wanted to be in charge. So I've never watched TV shows like Game of Thrones, but based on their ratings, clearly some people like this kind of confusion and fighting for the throne. I don't. I find it nasty and bloody. But you know, Game of Thrones is very similar to what dynastic life was like for so many Europeans in so much of their history. So France was confusing because of so many seemingly legitimate claims to power without a clear manifestation of it by anyone. Kings required the nobility to rule, but the nobles didn't always feel like they needed kings. So, a rigid feudal structure where kings ruled over nobles who ruled over peasants, with the church acting as a parallel power structure, that wouldn't really come into place for a couple hundred more years in France. So the question of who was really in charge was a serious one that led to lots of conflict. And as you'll see later in this discussion, that question really wasn't resolved until feudal structures came much later. So I mentioned earlier that the Frankish king's power paled in comparison to that of the previous Roman Empire. One thing that a certain ruler, Pippin III, as well as his son Charlemagne, both did was to try to capitalize on whatever link to the memory of Rome they could come up with. This wasn't at all uncommon, as I mentioned last week. The Seljuks, for example, even called their empire Rum at one point. But back to the Franks. In the 700s, the papal seat in Rome was being threatened by the Lombards, a Germanic group. Pippin III defeated them at a battle at Ravenna in the Italian peninsula in exchange for being anointed king by the Pope. It was unclear among the Franks whether they even had a king at that time, but with the Pope's sanction, Pippin could argue that it was God's will that he should be their king. His son would then go get another pope to declare that his realm, which expanded at this point across Western Europe, was the Holy Roman Empire, which I think the joke originated with Voltaire that it was neither holy, as the religious context of this empire was a total sham. It wasn't Roman; they were Germanic rulers, and it really wasn't an empire, as they had far less power than they imagined themselves to have over the territory that they claimed. So the thing that Charlemagne really needed to have political power, though, was the church. So in our day, institutions of governance, they're everywhere. You're all studying right now at a state school. We have post offices, police stations, army barracks, IRS offices, VA hospitals, aviary research stations. There's a really cool one in Ithaca that are all over the place. Charlemagne didn't have that kind of stuff, but the church sort of did. It had buildings, it had priests who collected money and knew who people were. So to be able to argue that a king was divinely appointed by God was a good way to be able to use the church for political purposes. So, as we'll see over the course of this class, that mixing of religion and politics, or the use of religion for political ends, would lead to no end of conflict in Europe in particular. But for Charlemagne, co opting the church seemed like an easy way to build a government without having to actually build a government. And again, last week in both the discussion boards and in the focus questions, I really tried to get you to zero in on what the importance of religion was as a unifying tool, as something that could build trust for transnational, cross border trade. So now we're seeing sort of the usurpation of religion for the purposes of really naked power and political means. And spoiler alert, it's going to be super problematic. So, well, I've downplayed Charlemagne a bit, implying that he was kind of a poser, a Roman wannabe. I want to emphasize that innovations under his rule really did build a foundation upon which people could imagine there to be something called Western Europe. His empire stretched from France to the Netherlands to the modern day Czech Republic down to Slovenia in the south. Carantania, as he called it. So it was a sort of political unit unified by the power of the Roman Catholic Church, where most elites ignored what came from the central authorities, not unlike the European Union today. So Charlemagne's empire was on par in many respects with Kiev Rus to the east, and at least able to play at the same table as the Islamic empires to the south, notably the Abbasids, as well as the remnant of Rome in Constantinople, the Byzantines. It was also part of broader trade circuits that tied into the Mediterranean and Middle East. So after his death, the empire split three ways. The Holy Roman Empire would comprise much of what is today Germany, as well as some areas to the east and south. France would be France, and Burgundy would be the rich trading area between the two. France was where the bulk of his accomplishments occurred, though his capital at Aachen is actually in Germany today. I mean, if you remember the map I showed you a minute ago, it didn't quite look like the France as we know it, but it was certainly covered the same territory as modern day France and a little bit more. So some have, when talking about Charlemagne's reign, have even talked about such a thing as a Carolingian Renaissance. He built monasteries. He built a religious school for priests in Paris that would later become the Sorbonne. He imported literate monks from Ireland. If you know anything about Irish, you know it's got weird spelling. So does French. One of the reasons for that is that Charlemagne, illiterate himself, paid scribes by the letter. So they came up with weird, heavy, letter heavy ways to spell things in both Irish and French. Charlemagne, though, even though he was illiterate, had a favorite book. It was St. Augustine's on the City of God, which theoretizes an ideal society in Earth, on Earth. So there was a dark side to this rule too. Massacres like that of the pagan Saxons in the north of Germany occurred under his reign. Non-believers couldn't stand in the way of his supposed perfect society. So I want to shift gears now and tell a story, have some story time. It's called The Song of Roland, and its origin, it seems to have first been told as an oral tradition sometime in the 11th century, though its setting is a few centuries earlier. So one of the things later generations would remember Charlemagne for was his defeat of the forces of the Cordoba Islamic Caliphate in the Pyrenees Mountains during the 8th century. And later, what extreme nationalists in Europe would often see that as somehow saving Europe from Muslims, and with the increase in really gross Islamophobia in Europe today, unfortunately, that aspect of Charlemagne is celebrated quite a bit in today's Europe. So, anyways, the story. It's fiction, but it's important fiction because it's fiction from 900 years ago. So the story follows two of Charlemagne's knights during this campaign against the caliphate to the south. So it follows Roland and his father-in-law, who he hates, Ganelon. So Roland and Ganelon don't get along. It's a story full of intrigue, deception, betrayal, and total medieval weirdness. So early in the story, Roland volunteers Ganelon to go on a special mission to meet with the emissaries of the Islamic armies, who they call Saracens in the story after the enemies of the later Crusade period. He does this because he hates him and wants him to get killed. Ganelon has his own set of tricks up his sleeve, though, and he makes a deal with the Saracen to tell him the location of Charlemagne so that he can kill him. Ganelon agrees to convert to Islam in exchange for becoming a prince within the caliphate, and for the Saracen later promising to kill Roland. Really, the sweetest gift Ganelon can get is for his son-in-law to get killed. So the Islamic armies surround Charlemagne, but before he can get captured, Roland notices what's happening and blows a horn so loud that his temples explode, and he dies, alerting Charlemagne to the danger, though not in time to save most of his troops. Charlemagne's armies are victorious once they arrive as reinforcements, and they also discover Ganelon's treachery and he gets executed. So the two anti-heroes who you don't really like die at the end, and the only redeeming quality seems to be that Providence protects the wise king, and Christianity wins out in the end. The story was popular for centuries, especially among camps of crusaders heading in for battle, and they told it in much more epic fashion than I just did. So one of the bonus questions you can tackle, for which there's absolutely no wrong answer, is why do you think such a story was popular for so long? You're welcome, of course, to reference outside sources if you'd like, maybe Google it, whatever. But if you know and really like the story, please complicate my somewhat dismissive summary of it. So, but I should defend it for a minute. The real hero, the real winner in this story is that you see the importance of royal power and you see that there is divine sanction of that royal power. So, all right, with this rather lengthy background to why France was a place this whole background is meant to show you why France was a place where the Pope felt he could, or the wannabe Pope could turn when trying to raise an army to help Constantinople, to raise the army that would fight the First Crusade. So I skipped a few hundred years after the end of the Carolingian dynasty. One Hugh Capet started the Capetian dynasty, and as far as feudalism goes, the tight control over people with three classes of society: those who work, the peasants; those who pray, the clergy; and those who fight, the nobility. Merchants and traders didn't fit into this system, which is why Karl Marx, thinks that these are the people that really overthrew feudalism. But the Capetian dynasty was more stable than any other kind of feudalism in Europe for a while at least. So France in the year 1095 was populous, relatively prosperous, and strong enough people-wise and money-wise to be able to finance crusading armies ish. So I want to give you one more piece of political weirdness as a background bit of history to the Crusades. It's called the investiture controversy. And so in 1075, 20 years before the Crusades started up in the Holy Roman Empire, or roughly Germany, remember one of the leftover kingdoms from Charlemagne, there was what would become a typical feudal dispute over religion and power. Henry IV, Holy Roman Emperor, believed that he should be the one to appoint or invest bishops with power. If you understand the structure of many Christian religions, especially the Roman Catholic Church, a bishop is, sort of like a regional governor over many. So a bishop rules over a diocese, which includes many parishes within it. So a bishop is the boss of, large numbers of priests and sometimes over dynastic orders as well, um, or monastic orders. I'm sorry. So, Henry IV believed that he should be the one to appoint bishops and give them their power, and the Pope was like, "No, that's my job. And besides, you're practicing simony, or the selling of priesthood offices." The notion of simony comes from the New Testament in the book of Acts, when a person named Simon sees Peter healing people with the power of God and asks to buy that power. And Peter's like, "Whoa, you don't buy the power of God. What's wrong with you?" So the fact that the Holy Roman Emperor was trying to sell offices in the church made the Pope be like, "Whoa, that's not how we do things." So this was more than a question of lines of authority, though. Controlling bishops was really a good way to pay back favors and have control over the tithes that church leaders collected, tithing being a kind of religious tax. So each leader wanted to put their own people into the bishoprics. Many of the princes of the empire sided with the Pope, not perhaps out of devotion, but more to have leverage against their emperor, with whom they were in conflict. So Henry IV, he essentially excommunicated the Pope. The Pope excommunicated him back. Henry IV was one of many rulers in the 11th century to be excommunicated over disputes with Rome. So the conflict was never really resolved, though at one point Henry IV couldn't deal with a rebellion by his princes, so he walked to Rome barefoot, wearing only sackcloth, and bowed at the feet of the Pope to ask for forgiveness. The Pope forgave him, though Henry would rebel again as soon as he felt strong enough. So that rebellion was ongoing at the time of the First Crusade, and one of the things that Frankopan does is that's one of your readings for this week is to nicely complicate its history by looking at the messed up lives of the rulers who started the crusade. He does this by focusing on the Eastern perspective, something that's really quite innovative. There are many histories of how the Crusades started and how they progressed. They go something to the effect of Constantinople was under siege, the patriarch of the church there sent a call to Rome for help, and brave, largely French knights came to the rescue of the people in the east, then got a little out of control and massacred men, women, and children by the time they made it to Jerusalem. Once they got there, they didn't really care about helping Christians anymore, but set up kingdoms of their own. Islamic forces ignored them at first, but eventually got annoyed enough to fight back. So the Europeans sent more troops, had more crusades, but they lost because there were more and better prepared Islamic armies fighting against them. So what Frankopan does, as the title of this book indicates, is to focus on the call from the east. He shows that while the Byzantine emperor, Alexios, hoped to some degree for reconciliation between his branch of Christianity and that practiced in Rome, you have to remember that in 1056, there was an official split between the Christians of the East and the Christians of the West. So the Christians of the West, the Roman Catholics, had their center in Rome. The Christians of the East, Eastern Orthodox Christians, had their center in Constantinople. So today, Christians from the Middle East, from Eastern Europe, from Greece, they largely follow rites that are associated with Eastern Orthodoxy, and there are many smaller subdivisions within this as well that don't necessarily fit together. Whereas Christians of the West largely follow either Roman Catholicism or Protestant religious traditions that have split off from Roman Catholicism. So that had only just happened at the time of the First Crusade. So there was a hope among people in the West that maybe they could brush over their differences and unite the church again. So he Urban II figured that he could use the possibility of reuniting the church through a special holy war to cement his claim to the papacy against Clement III, who he called an anti-pope. Um, oh, sorry, I skipped a couple things. Okay, so, well, leaving open the idea of reconciliation, Alexios also feared for his empire's poor performance against the Seljuks, who were a Turkic group of people who espoused a more radical view of Islam than the dominant Abbasid Caliphate. So the Abbasids, they disliked the Seljuks too, and the Seljuks' prowess in fighting against and eventually defeating the Crusaders would contribute to the weakening of the Abbasid Caliphate too. So in Rome, as was often the case, there wasn't a clear line of succession to Pope, and two popes claimed the Holy See. Urban II figured he could, and I said this already, figured he could use the possibility of reuniting the church to cement his claim against Clement III, who he called an anti-pope. So he proved to be correct in this assumption. His speech at Clermont in France, calling on French knights to participate in this holy war, would prove to be a masterful rhetorical stroke with absolutely horrifying effects. If there's anything I've learned from history, it's to think clearly about the appeal of powerful speeches, especially if those speeches are trying to convince you to hate someone. So at the same time that he was trying to win support for his papacy from Rome, as many bishops as possible, and even Alexios, he also won the support of those dissenting from Henry IV. Henry IV's wife, Euproxia, who was from Kiev, an area using Constantinople's liturgy rather than Rome's, along with her son Conrad, both supported Urban II as pope, rather than Clement, who their father and husband supported. This was in part because of their horrifying sexual of the horrifying sexual abuse that Euproxia suffered at the hands of her husband. This abusive family drama helped propel Urban II into the papacy and really helped to cause the First Crusade. So, from a systemic perspective, the First Crusade was devastating. It terrorized the powerful Middle Eastern trade economies of the Levant region and Constantinople. 100 years later, Crusaders would sack Constantinople, even though they were fellow Christians, a sacking which led to long term decline for the capital of the Byzantine Empire. And they weakened the powerful, stable Abbasids. So remember, I mean, the Abbasids, they were at the core of this, you know, peaceful, prosperous world of trade that I had you read about last week. The Crusades, they strengthened some maritime powers like the Venetians and Florentines in Italy, but were largely a series of centuries long loss of life that hardened boundaries between Islam and Christianity as well as between Christianity and Judaism. The massacres of Jewish people in Mainz by Crusaders in 1096 can really be seen as an unfortunate turning point leading to centuries of more harsh treatment by European Christians towards Jewish people. So, to review, last week we talked about an archaic world system that was relatively stable and peaceful, tying together much of the world through the lucrative trade routes of the Middle East and Indian Ocean trading systems. The Crusades ultimately took what had been a consensus that tolerance was good for business and turned it into rather rigid divisions, especially for Europeans. Islam became the great other for Europeans, as did Judaism. The devastation of the Crusades would weaken the Abbasid Caliphate, which was the largest and most prosperous of the Islamic empires in the period of archaic globalization. This caliphate would ultimately meet its end with the disaster we're going to deal with next week, the Mongol invasions. So, all right, I hope that this presentation helps you to contextualize your focus questions and discussion board posts. I also hope it helps you think about the place of Western civilization in broader world history. So have some fun with these bonus questions now, and you know where to find me if you have any questions at all. Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. at the Zoom link that's listed at the top of your Ranko Hall page. All right, thanks everyone. Have a good week. Bye.